good afternoon, and welcome to a webinar on Codex opportunities for food manufacturers, hosted by EAS Consulting Group and presented by EAS Senior Director for Food Consulting Services, Alan Sayler, and EAS Independent Consultant, Richard White. EAS Consulting Group, a member of the Certified family of companies, is a global leader in regulatory solutions for industries regulated by FDA, USDA, and other federal and state agencies. Our network of over 150 independent consultants and advisors enables EAS to provide comprehensive consulting, training, and auditing services, ensuring proactive regulatory compliance, including requirements of the Food Safety Modernization Act and Foreign Supplier Verification Program, generally recognized as safe submissions to FDA, enhancing food safety programs under Codex, and acting as a U.S. agent. Today's presenters are Alan Sayler and Richard White. Alan Sayler is Senior Director of Food Consulting Services at EAS with expertise in the areas of food processing, particularly dairy processing, infant formula, bakery products, food additives, botanical products, and food packaging, as well as GSFI third-party certification programs such as Safe Quality Foods. Alan has spent more than 30 years as a food processing and regulatory expert, with half of that time serving the industry and the other half as a state and federal government employee. His international experience includes representing the U.S. food processing industry at the Codex committees on food additives, food labeling, food hygiene, and milk products. Richard White provides expert advice regarding international standards, national policies, and regulations on animal and plant health, with a focus on activities of the Codex Commission and subsidiary bodies. Prior to consulting, some of Richard's former positions included Senior Director of Codex and International Standards with GMA, Senior Director, Sanitary and Phytosanitary at USTR, Director for International Activities at EPA. He serves on the Codex committees of food additives, food labeling, contaminants, nutrition and foods for special dietary uses, and general principles. As a reminder, during the webinar, you may ask any questions by typing them into the questions box. And with that, I will turn the webinar over to Alan.
Thank you very much, Amy. This is Alan Sayler, and I guess the appropriate greeting could be good morning, good afternoon, or good evening. We have participants from all over the globe. So I am going to proceed with a little bit of quick background on Codex. Some of you, this is duplicative, but I think it's important for those that may be new. Codex is an organization under the United Nations. It was actually started in 1962, and it is managed within the UN structure by the Food and Agricultural Organization, FAO, and the World Health Organization, WHO. The administrative and financial resources for Codex come from those two bodies. 188 countries are members, and the EU, which is the governmental body with 28 or 27 member states, I believe, is viewed as one of those. There's certainly NGOs. Of the NGOs, the International Dairy Federation, which is our private organizations with international scope that can be part and a participant in the Codex meetings, is the only one that's recognized as having some extra access or influence within the Codex system. So moving on, with that said, and we'll try and move on. Let's see. Let's see what happened here. Try again. Apologize, Amy. Looks like we had. So let's move on. And the background of Codex is, what is Codex? It's intended to establish food standards that enhance international trade and protect consumers and facilitate trade. It is based on science. This is absolutely fundamental. As politics, I am not to say that politics doesn't play a role in Codex, but the decisions are supposed to be science-based. Also, it has a unique status within the trade organizations internationally. Richard's going to cover that in more detail, so I will not. What is it not? When these food standards are established, they are not mandatory. They are strongly recommended that all member countries consider adopting them. There isn't a deadline for adopting them. However, it is encouraged, and I will tell you that there are a number of countries around the world that take Codex standards as their law and regulations. So if you are exporting into these markets, these Codex standards become terribly of the business of Codex. I'm not going to go through all of these because we're going to cover some at the end and some of the hot topics in these committees, but to suffice it to say that there are general subcommittees such as food additives, food hygiene, contaminants. We're going to cover some of those. There are commodity committees, and believe it or not, you're going to say, well, there should be a whole page of commodity committees. There actually are, but many of them are adjourned, and not every food sector has a commodity committee within the Codex system. And finally, there are task forces, some of which are the intention of task forces, by the way, is to deal with the subject and then dissolve. And there are also regional coordinating committees. The regional coordinating committees divide the globe up into sectors so that countries that have some common interests can talk about what their positions and needs are within the Codex system. The Codex Secretariat, as far as the staffing and such, I'm not even going to cover this. Let's just say that the most important thing on this slide is it is headquartered in Rome, Italy. And a step process, how does a Codex standard or guideline or other document become final? There are 8 steps, and I'm not going to cover them all, but the important steps, these slides, by the way, Amy is going to make available to you after we are completed with the webinar today. So some of this will be covered quite quickly, but there are 8 steps. The important steps are, when can you have the opportunity to comment? And that is at step 3 and at step 6. The step 2 is to develop the original standard or guideline language in draft form. And then after comments at step 3, the updates are made at step 5. There's a determination whether to go forward or to send it back for additional drafting and updating. Finally, if it looks good, it goes to step 6 for further comments. And then if these comments are incorporated at step 7, the standard or guideline is moved to step 8 for adoption at the overall committee, which is called the Codex Alimentarius Commission. There is a shortcut. You can actually go from step 5 to step 8. It's like a secret off-ramp that, except it's not so secret, everybody knows about it. If there's a huge amount of consensus at step 5 to the existing language of a guideline or standard, it can move right from 5 to 8 for adoption. And that has been used a lot in Codex over the past few years. I'm going to stop here and turn it over to my colleague, Richard White. And Richard, I'll try and keep the slides moving as you asked.
Okay, great. Thank you very much, Alan. It's a pleasure for me to be in contact with you all today to talk about Codex and its importance both to international trade and to protecting public health. And that Codex mission received important recognition and elevated recognition with the enactment of the WTO agreements. The WTO was established in 1995 after over 8 years of negotiation, and it did a number of things that affect the food industry and agricultural concerns around the world. It made some minor modifications to the TBT agreement, which had been in place since 1979. But the major thing that the WTO enactment brought to bear was the agreement on sanitary and phytosanitary measures, and we commonly refer to that as the SPS agreement. And so for the first time in a trade organization, food safety, animal health, and plant health issues were specifically addressed, and in the trade parlance, they say the rules tried to put disciplines or direction, if you will, on how national governments set these food safety, plant health, and animal health measures. As part of this effort, the agreement specifically recognizes the Codex Alimentarius Commission as the reference body for trade disputes. And in doing so, it elevated the visibility of Codex in many governments around the world, because one of the differences is you in Codex, as a private sector entity, you do have the ability to participate, and I'll talk more about that a little later. But at the WTO, it is strictly government to government. And so if you need to have an issue, you need to contact the government to carry that forward into the WTO. So that's an important distinction between Codex and the WTO. But recognizing Codex in the SPS agreement was a major step forward for Codex. And I think the other thing to keep in mind is that the SPS agreement does not set standards. It relies on the standards and expects members to apply the standards of the Codex Alimentarius Commission, the International Organization for Animal Health, or OIE, and the International Plant Protection Convention. So particularly in the United States, when this trade negotiation was going on, U.S. regulators, and at that point I was working at EPA, which regulates pesticides, was very concerned about trade officials setting standards that could impact their regulatory authority in the United States. And one of the things I'll also talk about a little later is that the common denominator between the trade people and the regulatory people, the food safety people, was science-based standards. There, everyone agreed that that was the way to move forward in setting standards and resolving disputes. The other major thing that was accomplished by the WTO was a binding dispute settlement process, commonly known as the DSU. It's the Understanding on Settlement of Disputes. And this sets out a sort of a complicated process that I'll also talk about a little later. The other thing that was important in the United States is when the Uruguay Round Act was passed by the Congress in 1994, it set USTR as the sole representative to the WTO. And this was an effort to calm down the interagency disagreements that came up over who should represent the United States at this trade body. So moving on to slide 13, the WTO SPS obligations. Here, it is important to understand that as WTO does not set standards, it does not tell member states of the WTO what to do. Rather, the SPS agreement tells members, prescribes for members the way they should do things. And those are called the SPS obligations. And broadly speaking, those SPS obligations include developing domestic regulations on the basis of science, and preferably with a risk assessment that can be viewed by the private sector as well as other governments. So science-based decision-making is the key, just as it is in Codex, also at the WTO. SPS measures are to be developed in a transparent manner, which means that other WTO members have the opportunity to review and comment on what is hopefully a proposed, not final measure that's submitted as a WTO notification. And this is very familiar to the US notice and comment process. And in fact, it was the obligation, the text of the agreement was fashioned after the US Administrative Procedure Act. The other major SPS obligation is that members are to develop measures that are, quote, not more restrictive than required, unquote. And this may seem like an abstract concept, but further on in the agreement, it says that members are to consider alternatives that still achieve the objective they have in mind, and then select the least trade restrictive alternatives. So there is some guidance provided on how WTO members are to proceed on this. As I mentioned earlier, I talked a little bit about the dispute settlement procedures. These are new procedures and make the WTO a unique organization in the international structure, regardless of whether it's a UN or some other kind of agency. I'm not aware of any other place where there is a binding dispute settlement mechanism such as in the WTO. Certainly, it has a lot of problems. A lot of people don't like it. I'm not sure that there's anyone that actually likes it, but in any event, it is there, and it is used with a lot of attention by members. And essentially how that happens is if you have a measure or regulation in place, and this applies to all WTO agreements, and there's over a dozen, and there's multiple understandings. So the WTO text is almost 500 pages, and the dispute settlement mechanism applies to all of them, not just SPS. So if a member institutes a measure that another member thinks is inconsistent, the member may challenge it in the dispute settlement body at the WTO. After a very complicated process, it is the issue, if it's unresolved, is then sent to a WTO dispute settlement panel made up of experts. So these are not people that in the food safety context that also participate in the dispute over airplane subsidies. These would be food, plant health, or animal health experts that consider the material presented to it by both parties. And it is it's a structured legal proceeding. They don't, and the decisions come out are, may be appealed to the WTO appellate body, and the appellate body's decision is final. And the way that this is a binding dispute settlement process is that if the member that lost does not remove the measure that was challenged, then the winning member may impose tariffs commensurate to the value of the trade that was lost. And so, for example, in the late 1990s, the WTO, the US challenged the EU's restrictions on hormone-treated beef imports. We won the case in the dispute settlement panel. We appealed, the EU appealed, and we won that appeal in the appellate body, and the EU did not remove its offending measure in a, quote, reasonable time, unquote, and then the United States was then able to impose tariffs on imports from the EU commensurate with the amount of exports of beef that we lost, and that was all decided at the WTO. So that's generally how that works. Certainly, there's a lot of complaints about that process, but it is in place, and in an SPS context, the United States has done very well in winning those cases. Okay, turning to the structure of the U.S. Codex organization, and this is all within the U.S. government. Many of you may be aware that there is a U.S. Codex office. It is part of the Undersecretary of Agriculture's Trade and Foreign Agricultural Affairs Office. The Undersecretary chairs a Codex Policy Committee, and I'll talk a little bit about that later. And in the United States, the head of delegation to the different Codex committees is responsible for developing draft U.S. government positions. But these are draft positions and have to be circulated through an interagency process that the U.S. Codex office manages. So they are the focal point in the United States for internal policy development, as well as coordinating how that U.S. policy is projected into all the committees of the Codex Alimentarius Commission. On the next slide, so I'm at 16, Alan. On the next slide, you can see the major agencies that participate in the Codex Policy Committee and see those positions and review and comment on them. Also, these are the agencies where many of our Codex delegates work full-time. So, for example, at EPA, the U.S. delegate to the Codex Committee on Pesticide Residues works at EPA, actually in the residue in the office that sets residue standards. The same in FDA. There are many heads of our delegation, U.S. Codex delegates that come from either the Center for Food Safety and Applied Nutrition or the Center for Veterinary Medicine, and also others. But the regulatory agencies in the United States normally lead the U.S. delegation to the relevant committee. Trade officials are members of those delegations, but in most cases do not lead the delegation. So it's a science-based agency leading the U.S. representative at a science-based organization. Going on to 17, private sector participation in Codex is a unique attribute for an international organization. It is rare that the private sector has the opportunity to participate in the standards development that ultimately affects their imports, exports, and their business. U.S. delegates and other Codex agency staff consult almost on a routine basis on each agenda item as they develop positions for the upcoming meetings. This is almost a regularized process. In addition to those informal consultations, which oftentimes are technical, the U.S. Codex office is responsible for convening a public meeting where the U.S. delegate presents the draft U.S. government positions and provides an opportunity for those in the public as well as those representing food companies, agricultural interests, trade associations, whatever. It's an open meeting to all who wish to come. And they can offer comments on the draft positions. And those comments can be submitted orally at the meeting, or they can be presented in writing. And the U.S. Codex office's responsibility is to ensure that those issues are addressed in the U.S. position in some way. Okay, so that was the private sector's opportunity to participate within the U.S. Policy setting framework. On slide 18 is a description of how the private sector can participate in the meetings of Codex itself. And there are several ways that can happen. The first and probably the most often, that country's delegation to Codex meetings. So in my role at GMA and in my role now as a consultant, I attend several Codex meetings as a member of the U.S. delegation representing the interest of my clients, not the interest of the government. And in that capacity, I can provide input on the potential business effects and technological concerns with any particular text that may be presented for discussion during a Codex meeting. The Codex also has observers, and these observers are usually international trade associations that reflect the concerns and interests of a particular sector. And Alan mentioned IDFA, and that's certainly one, but there are many, many observer organizations that have been officially accredited by Codex and FAO, WHO to participate in Codex meetings. And the other important thing to keep in mind is while many of them reflect the private sector or industry views, there are a substantial number of observer organizations that represent environmental interests, represent certain, let's say, baby food interests and things like that. And they participate in meetings as they choose, but They do receive all documents. They can participate in any meeting they choose to attend. And at certain points in each meeting, observers are provided opportunities to speak to the entire committee that is physically present. So this is a very important distinction among international organizations, that the private sector has an opportunity to provide written as well as oral comments on standards and other texts that are under consideration. And I think the purpose of what we're bringing to your attention today is that these are important opportunities that we certainly believe the food industry writ large, and the largest meaning of those words, should take advantage of, because in the end, it's the food and agricultural products that are going to be affected by these standards. Certainly governments have a major role, but it's really going to be your products that are affected in international trade by Codex standards. And the other thing to keep in mind is, while there are observers there, governments make the final decisions on the text and of course, all administrative kinds of things. But as I said, the private sector observers can provide technical and business expertise on Codex draft text. So as they go through the step process that Alan provided some information on, there are opportunities for both member governments and observers to provide specific comments. So now we'll turn to a couple of, well, several of the more significant, I think, Codex committees, that many of which have upcoming meetings, and just generally review the subject matter that they will be dealing with. And before we begin this, I just want to make an overarching statement that each committee has a different character, and that character is dictated by who governments send to those meetings. And so if you get someone from the Ministry of Health and they don't have anybody from the Ministry of Trade, you may get some comments that seem at odds with their international trade interests, for example. One of the things that I've learned over 20 years in this is that there are few governments around the world that actually have the interagency consultative process that the United States does. And the consequence of that is, at some meetings, you get a representative from a country who represents the views of their ministry, normally the Ministry of Health, but it doesn't represent the full government's views, because they didn't consult with other ministries in their government before they came off to this meeting and said some things that in some cases actually disadvantage their both public health interests and their international trade interests. So CCFX is a committee on import-export certification and inspection systems that is hosted by Australia, which means they absorb the administrative costs of holding the meeting. And the major cost factor in all of these meetings is having translations, simultaneous translations into 3, and in many cases 5 languages. So that's a major cost. And at any given meeting, there'll be 200 delegates in the room. So it can be a large meeting, and there are substantial costs. And so that's why you'll see different committees hosted by different countries. As Alan mentioned, the Codex Secretariat is jointly funded by WHO FAO, and they provide overall logistical support and policy advice on Codex procedures and things like that. But the conduct of the meeting is done by member governments at meeting locations as they choose. So one of the primary things that's happened in CCFX is that a lot of the provisions of the Food Safety Modernization Act the U.S. has been pretty successful in getting Codex to take up similar, if not the same, kinds of obligations. So what happens here in the United States regarding, for example, voluntary third-party certificates and paperless electronic certificates, and this whole notion of national food control systems is a reflection of the U.S. effort to raise these issues to an international level and to develop some kind of counterpart at the international level that comports with the U.S. national system. One of the major things that's going on in CCFX is related to while we're doing a maintenance of equivalence of national food control systems, and that's at step 3, a very early stage. Over the last 5 to 7 years, there has been work in CCFX to define and set a standard, or a text rather, for national food control systems for all Codex members. CCFX over its existence and recent existence has dealt a lot with information exchange, particularly under emergency circumstances. So when there's a foodborne outbreak, who communicates what to whom, and also how quickly, because the effort is to get control of the emergency and mitigate the impacts, especially in this case, in the importing country. So CCFX has developed text on that have been through the entire process. Equivalence has been a difficult issue, so I'm moving now on to 21, Alan. Equivalence is a difficult concept that really finds its basis in the WTO SPS agreement. And many of the standard setting bodies, well, the 3 standard setting bodies, have sought to take the equivalence and develop parallel guidance within the food safety context, the animal health context, and the plant health context on equivalence. So equivalence looks different in different places, but it's a subject that engenders a lot of discussion and debate, because in many cases equivalence is in the eye of the beholder and nowhere else. So that's different around the world. You can see there's this food integrity and authenticity work that is ongoing, and before a proposal enters the step process, in many cases, not all, but in many, a country will propose a subject for new work. And then the committee will decide whether that new work should be undertaken or not. And in a lot of cases, that new work is undertaken by a country that will develop a discussion paper that is then considered at the next meeting, that flushes out a lot of the details of what would be included, and also a work program on how to get from the discussion paper stage into the step process and finally to an adopted standard. And that is called a project document. And this food integrity and authenticity proposal is at this very early stage of being a discussion paper. But it was interesting to find so many differences in what was meant by the term food authenticity. And in different parts of the world, it means different things. So that's been part of the discussion that has really delayed getting this kind of work started. The Codex Committee on General Principles, this is a committee that is hosted by France and is different from the other committees. As I mentioned, in the CCFX food authenticity issue, a member can propose new work that then goes through the approval process within the Codex Commission and the committee to start that work. Well, excuse me, the Codex Committee on General Principles has a different mandate. That the Committee on General Principles only takes proposals that are referred to it by the Codex Commission. So it cannot self-initiate new proposals. And I think that when the terms of reference for this committee were drafted many years ago, we didn't appreciate how important that is, because we now have a lot of pressure coming from, frankly, a lot of European member states that want to change things in the Codex Committee on General Principles. And the United States and others, notably Australia, Canada, and some others, and even from Africa, have pushed back saying that these changes were not given to the Codex Committee on General Principles by the Codex Alimentarius Commission, and therefore it's out of order to consider them. And that has been an important tactical tool that has been used recently in this committee. This committee also, to back up a minute, when the WTO SPS agreement was concluded, and it made reference to the Codex Alimentarius Commission and its standards, Codex rightly took to underpin the scientific commitment to its standards and its decision-making. And they developed several, two documents in particular. The one is there, the statements of principle and statements concerning the role of science. And these are now, especially in the United States, considered to be absolutely essential documents. And part of the reason why they are so valuable to the United States is because domestically, we base all of our food safety decisions and standards on risk assessments. And we do that as a matter of legislative requirement. Our laws require a risk assessment. And Codex has embraced that same thing through the SPS agreement. But now there are some pressures coming, primarily again from Europe, to take other factors, not related to science necessarily, into account. And that would fundamentally change, and in the view of many, undermine the Codex commitment to science-based decision-making, which then raises the issue of what's the role and what is the commitment and the standing of Codex before the SPS committee, since the SPS committee has embraced science-based decision-making. If Codex were to introduce factors other than science, does that in some way undermine the standing of Codex within the SPS agreement? So these are very highly charged and controversial issues that we believe are sort of lurking underneath the agenda of many European countries to this committee. And those issues will probably surface at this March meeting, but as I said, they will then have to surface them again at the Codex Alimentarius Commission, which meets in July of every year, to get approval to move forward with anything like that. But this is a major issue in Codex, and to the extent that your companies and your interests value science-based decision-making, especially in international trade, this is an area where you may want to pay attention and participate as you can through your government or through an accredited observer organization. The next committee that I will speak to is the Committee on Fats and Oils. It's chaired by Malaysia, and they have several standards in place that need to be updated as new products come into the market and as new ingredients are developed and used in these oil products. And so there's a standing agenda item almost on the naming of new vegetable oils. And I know some people in that aspect of the food industry are really interested in coming up with and not having another name like high oleic oil, but having a more consumer-friendly name that both is descriptive, but also not so chemically oriented, if you will. As these new products come in and are used, they need to be added to the list of acceptable previous cargo. So this is for bulk shipments of oils, and various ingredients that get added for one reason or another may contaminate a subsequent shipment of a commodity in that tank. And so Codex maintains this list of previous acceptable cargoes for commercial tank ship operations. And those are the major issues that come up in the Committee on Fats and Oils. And with that, Alan, I will return the mic to you.
Thank you very much, Richard. I appreciate that overview. From here, we're going to go through a number of individual Codex committees. And what I'd like to do, if I can get the slide to advance, is to cover these. The point of all of this is that I don't care what kind of a food sector, what kind of a food that you are making, even if you don't export it from your country, Codex standards are going to impact you. And I can go into detail, but we don't have the time. So I'm going to hit some high points of about 4 other committees, only to demonstrate how important Codex and its standard setting activities are to individual companies. And if you are here for the first time learning about Codex, I think you're going to go away with how can we not participate in some way, whether it is through your trade association, through your government. It is absolutely critical. And this is universal. So my points here are not going to be country specific. They are going to be hitting the high points and why this is important to food manufacturers around the world. Codex Committee on Food Hygiene, somewhat self-explanatory. It is led by the U.S., just like Richard had said, other committees are led by other countries. I'm going to hit a couple of things. There is a code of practice on allergen management. And of note there is they are recommending that the Codex Committee on Food Labeling, which I'll cover at the end, have some precautionary statements that recommend that governments adopt regarding government labeling requirements for allergens. The other thing that there is a little bit of updating left in this general principles document. General principles on food hygiene has been around a long time, and there is a lot of things there that you should pay attention to. Very little change right now. I'd like to go on to management of biological foodborne outbreaks. Now, do you, as a government, do you have to use these guidelines? The answer is no, but it is at step 5, and it is chaired by Denmark, co-chaired by Chile and the EU, and they are preparing. This is very likely to go forward. If you're a small country that doesn't have the resources to build your own regulation on how to manage or require industry to manage biological foodborne outbreaks, you use the Codex system. Also, this one, the next one, which is at step 4, it was moved back to step 4 because, as you can tell, this is a bit controversial. In some parts of the world, the consumption of raw products like meat, cheese, and milk is pretty standard. In other parts of the world, this is either restricted or carefully managed, monitored, regulated. And so therefore, they're trying to figure out how you can have these products in the marketplace while at the same time ensuring their safety against E. coli. So that is important. There's also something I would strongly encourage you to pay attention to. There's a developing guideline on the safe use and reuse of water and food production. It's out for a comment now at step 3, and since the committee is not going to meet until late this year in 2020, Right now, you have the opportunity to provide input. Now, you as an individual company, it'd be difficult unless you put it into your government as an individual company, but you can also do two things: put it into your country and put it into your trade association. Next committee is a long mouthful called the Codex Committee on Nutrition for Special Dietary Uses. What does this cover? Sports drinks, infant formulas, follow-up formulas, medical foods, which country that you produce product in. This is managed by Germany. This is one of the more controversial committees. It takes maybe conservative is a good word to use, conservative approaches to things, and it sometimes tends to be very centered on the European approach, not always, but it's important. It's a tremendously important and affects a lot of food manufacturers. So of those topics that are coming into play, I'm not going to hit everything on every slide. Right now, they are trying to come up with a standard for laboratory testing for vitamins in some of these nutritional products, particularly infant formulas, things of that nature. And depending on the laboratory method, the amount that you're given credit for can change sometimes dramatically. It's important. The next thing is a document or a guideline on ready-to-use therapeutic foods. What is that? Well, these could be things that have some medical benefit. They could be a medical food. They could be a novel food. There's something special about them, and the nutrition is really critical for those kinds of foods. That document is at step 5, so it could actually be finalized and go to step 8 if it takes a shortcut. I don't think so, because there's a fair amount of controversy, so it'll probably go to step 6 where there's more comment. Suffice it to say, if you put product in or make product in this category, you want to pay attention to the development of this Codex standard. Moving on, follow-up formula. This is a term that's used in a number of countries, including the EU countries, for formulas that are intended for children age 6 months and up, or 6 months to 12, depending on the government regulation. And again, this was completed, but it was held at step 7. Step 8 is where it gets finalized. And there are some concerns in here. Some of the labeling provisions are going to be evaluated by the Codex Committee on Food Labeling. There are certain sections like the scope, the definition, and labeling that some sections were advanced and others are being held. So without trying to be too confusing, you may have some opportunities. I will be very frank with you. By the time you get to step 6 and 7, it is much more difficult to get changes. So if you say, well, I'm just going to see where things go and we'll wait till the end and then try and make a change, it is very difficult. If you want to see changes or you want your views adopted, get involved at step 1, 2, and 3. That's important. Other things, the nitrogen conversion factor, which for many of you is an absolute foreign language or foreign term, is very important in these infant formulas, follow-up formulas, toddler formulas, because there is not an effective laboratory way to measure protein. So you measure nitrogen and convert it to protein. The problem is the conversion factor is debated highly because some protein sources, some vegetable protein sources, do not have a good conversion factor. So the amount of protein they are given credit for is less than, for instance, dairy milks. And if you're in the dairy industry, you're happy about it. If you're in the soy or plant industry, you're not so happy about it. So this is being reviewed to determine if any changes need to be made. Moving on, NRVs, I'm not trying to talk in, again, a new language. This is nutritional reference values. They're looking at whether for older children and younger children probably over the age of 12 months, whether it needs to be changed and adjusted. So that is a discussion point. There are also other things, and this is very sensitive to me because I've spent most of my Codex career in food additives, but the horizontal committees like food additives, all other committees are supposed to comply with their guidelines, recommendations. They actually, food additives needs to look at any food additives decisions made by these other committees. It appears that CCNFSDU is trying to make up new rules that may or may not be in line with the Codex Committee on Food Additives. And while if you're part of CCNFSDU, you think that's appropriate, if you are a longtime member and fought the good fight in CCFA to get these guidelines established, then find another committee is established of their own. This is a concern. So we will see where this goes. This is tremendously important. And there are other things too. I'm going to move on for time's sake. You can look at the slide deck here. I would like to go to Codex Committee on Food Additives. It meets in China. It's hosted by China. Food additives are probably the easiest way to prevent your food from being brought into my country. I can simply say there's a food additive you use, I haven't reviewed, I don't like, or I'm not going to tell you, I just don't want your food in my country, so I'm going to declare it has a food additive that's not acceptable. The nice thing is the Codex Committee on Food Additives is tremendously prolific. It probably reviews and makes decisions on over 500 to 1,000 food additives per year. I've been involved in that since about 2002, and it's a very good committee. Lots of different opinions. The Chinese secretary does an excellent job hosting this. Right now, one of the major topics is there are two systems of food additives in Codex. One is called the General Standard for Food Additives, the GSFA. I call it the Bible, because you can look in there and you can find out what food additives Codex has said is okay in what foods. Very simple. The problem is there's a second reference, which is slowly being eliminated, and that is you can go into individual Codex commodity standards. You can go into something for chocolate. You can go into something for infant formula. You can go into something for cheese. And you will find that these standards have food additive sections, and they aren't always the same as the GSFA or the Bible. What Codex Committee on Food Additives is doing is they're aligning to eliminate all the food additives in these individual commodity standards. So everything will, at some point, maybe in 5 years, maybe 10 years, all will be in the Bible. In addition, we have sweeteners. Now, there's been a lot of difficulty with countries realizing that there are food additives in Codex that most of the world thinks is fine, but my country doesn't think is okay. So what do? So there was this Note 161 that said, it's okay for Codex to adopt this, but I am imposing Note 161, which says you can use it if shipped to any country but mine. Well, this started being used every time a food additive was adopted. And pretty soon, it was clear that the Codex Committee on Food Additives was becoming redundant because it was of no value. Codex is supposed to establish an even playing field, not exceptions after exception after exception. So right now we are trying to eliminate the Codex Note 161, and we think that in the very near future this will occur. This is being worked on very hard. It took a lot of, there's probably more negotiation to resolve Note 161 than there was to resolve some stalemates or wars around the world, but it looks like it's getting done. In addition, these next few slides, I'm not going to cover in any detail, but these slides are to represent the fact that food additives are being decided upon in everything, in chocolate, in fresh foods and vegetables, in dairy products, in meats. And if you aren't at the table, some of the decisions on food additives in foods that are very important for you may be finalized. And maybe there's a food additive nobody spoke up about, so it was dropped, not because it was a problem, because nobody thought it was of value. And so I would encourage you in the realm of food additives to check or to get back to us. I do want to say that EAS has a number of Codex experts. Mr. White, myself are just a few. We have others who would be happy to talk to you offline about this. There are other provisions, but I do want to go on to a couple of other committees, and that is the Codex Committee on Contaminants. It's being hosted by the Netherlands, and it sets up standards on contaminants. In other words, what can you have in foods or what shouldn't you have in foods related to heavy metals, aflatoxins, other things. And so you can see that they are working on things as diverse as aflatoxins in peanuts. They're talking about radioactivity in foods. There's a discussion paper being developed. There's everything from, and why this is in the same line is very odd to me, but there are levels of contaminants being discussed for wines, for offal, and offal, maybe I should say that properly. Chocolates, cadmium in chocolates has been a huge concern, and almost a war between the views of those out of mostly the African countries versus the South American and Central American countries, and this is slowly being resolved. In addition, we have codes of practice for the certain types of contaminants in refined oils. We also have risk assessment when in contaminants where there is no regulatory level. What do you do when you're a country that doesn't have any? So there's a guideline that's being developed that could be used by these countries that don't have any contaminant legislation of any kind. And then certain approaches as to determining maximum levels of lead in various foods. There also is a proposed code of practice for prevention and reduction of lead in foods, also for a same concept for cadmium in cocoa, and also levels of aflatoxins or unacceptable levels of aflatoxins may be more appropriate in cereal grains consumed by infants and young children. Let's go on to food labeling, and this is the last committee I want to cover. This committee is an example of how profound the Codex impact can be. It is hosted by Canada, and it meets almost every year. It's been going now maybe every year and a half, but suffice to say, a lot of the various activities of other Codex committees have labeling provisions. And so the Codex Committee on Labeling has to review and make decisions. There was an effort the last couple of years to try and establish labeling criteria for biofortification. Some countries thought it was important, others thought it was not important, or at least not important in the Codex world, and so that work finally was discontinued. If there isn't activity after a certain number of years, the Codex Commission really, and the Codex Secretariat, encourage committees to drop that work. And that could be because it isn't important. It could be because there's no consensus on what direction to go. Also, I had mentioned earlier, CCFNCU has forwarded some of the labeling provisions of some of the foods like the follow-up forms and so forth. But in and of itself, the Codex Committee on Food Labeling also has developed proposed guidance for the labeling of non-retail containers. Now, you might think this is interesting because in most governments' legislations, the labeling of non-retail containers that consumers never see is either not defined, not described, or it is left up to the industry or agreements between two business entities, the customer and the provider. However, this is moving forward to step 5, and I think it has some controversy. I would be surprised if it goes to step 8, but it's always that possibility. In addition, we have other draft guidelines. That is important because how many countries actually have information on nutrition on the front of the label? Most of us have it on a side, a back, a top, a bottom, but this is developing guidelines for front to pack labeling. It's at step 3. It has some heavy headwinds because a lot of people either don't want it or have different views about what it should be. I will say that a lot of the effort to move this forward is coming out of South and Central America, and so we'll see where that goes. Also, there's a number of discussion papers, and these discussion papers bear watching because this is how you start working Codex. You have a discussion paper and you propose new work, then you're authorized to write a discussion paper, and this is a government that writes it, and then the discussion paper, if it is well written, is accepted for new work. So these discussion papers are a direction of where we might see Codex Committee on Food Labeling to go in the next year or two. Or internet sales. So a discussion paper on how to label internet sales. That is going to be very interesting because most governments don't have a lot on that right now. The US does, of course. The discussion paper on allergen labeling. How should allergens be labeled? Not which allergens to be labeled, at least we hope that doesn't go there, but how to label allergens. A discussion paper on innovative use of food labeling, and that to me is a bit surprising because there are so many types of technologies that you can apply to label a product today, but we'll see where that goes. Labeling of alcoholic beverages. You saw a discussion on food additives in wine, and this is a broader potential labeling document that Codex may generate on alcoholic beverages. And so and with my colleague, Mr. White, have covered a lot of ground in a short amount of time. I hope we weren't confusing. But what I'd like to say is, Amy, I know we're at the top for you that EAS has the ability. We have tremendous experience, probably with all of our experts, over almost 100 years of Codex experience, and we can help you find and weave your way through the Codex system. Amy?
Great. Thank you both so much for such a fantastic presentation. We do have time for a couple of questions. And let's see, I think I've got some that have come in. Let's see. Okay, Peter, thank you. We appreciate the compliment. Got a compliment that it was a great and informative webinar. One question that's come in is, how can companies proactively balance Codex with FSMA requirements for food sold in the US?
Richard, since I've been talking so much, do you want to tackle that first?
Well, I guess I'm not sure what's meant by balance, but I think that what the United States has sought to do is to take its standards, and especially in terms of processes and things like that, not so much the actual standards, but to take the process it uses to set standards and take those to the international forum, take them to Codex, so that you're using a risk assessment, and the risk assessment procedures of Codex are very similar to the risk assessment procedures of the FDA that have been revised in light of FSMA and everything. You know, but part of a risk assessment is exposure is going to differ around the world, and that creates some controversy. And the United States, if it has the scientific justification, can deviate from the Codex standard and not run afoul of the WTO obligations. So, you know, I think that if you have the science that supports a different standard, then you need to bring that forward for evaluation by FDA and ultimately take it into Codex when they consider the relevant standard. Alan, do you have any further?
Well, I think it's important to understand that if you're exporting, it doesn't matter what the U.S. standard is. You've got to meet the standard of the importing country. What Codex is trying to do is make the difference between the U.S. requirements and the importing country requirements less and less. A simple example, since I have dairy background, is what is butter? Well, butter is, everybody knows what butter is. Not really, because in certain parts of the world, the U.S. standard for butter would be violation. It would not be allowed to be sold. So what Codex is trying to do in the bigger picture is make the differences smaller so the trade can be facilitated so that the standards themselves do not inhibit trade. In the case of FSMA, the U.S. has, well, Canada is the most recent country to update its food safety legislation, but the Canadian system, while slightly different, is similar to the U.S. system. So right now, until another country moves the notch of food safety up at one more level, the U.S. and Canadian systems are the gold standard. So if you meet the FSMA standards in most countries that you export to, if you meet the U.S. standard or Canadian standard, you're probably going to meet that country's standard. Thank you. Amy, any other questions?
No, I don't see any other questions right now. I know we've run a bit long, so I thank you everyone for staying with us. And of course, you have Alan's information if you have any further questions or need EAS assistance in Codex or any other food safety matter. And thanks so much for joining us. I hope everyone has a great afternoon.